Welcome to Team C's BIS 343 final. This is Lainey Johnson and Michael Burchett presenting on team decision making.
Decision making involves gathering and processing information to evaluate and decide upon alternative courses of action. Decisions can be made by individuals as well as by groups. We will see that there are distinct advantages to group decision making over individual decision making. However, it can be fraught with bias and pitfalls. After this presentation, you should have an understanding of the nature of group decision making as well as the pitfalls to avoid to making it successful. Group decision making in its ultimate form looks like this. The group is oriented to and can define the problem. They set a goal, they plan a process, and they gather information and identify the alternatives. The group evaluates alternatives, exchanges information, and through this innovates possible new alternatives. From various perspectives, the group chooses an alternative and defines a solution. The group sets that solution in place and allows it to process. And they watch that solution as it unfolds and plays out to evaluate their decision, check the consequences, and gather any feedback that is necessary. That's ultimate form. Let's review decision-making from our own real-life experiences. All decision-making are influenced by several factors. Decisions made by individuals, as those of decisions made by groups, are at risk of subjectivity. Judgments by individuals specifically are at risk of bias. Bias can come in many forms. One is driven by how a decision is framed. Framing bias happens when the outcome of a decision is viewed as a gain or a loss. I see this at play when people ask me whether I see a glass as half full or half empty. I honestly don't know which one's supposed to be optimistic, considering either one optimistic or pessimistic is an example. Another individual of bias that may come into play in decision making is overconfidence. People are prone to assume that their judgments are sound, regardless of the accuracy. In several examples, over 90% of individuals surveyed believe they are above average. I'm 110% confident that this is statistically impossible. Confirmation bias is extremely prevalent in my experience in the business world, probably through no small factor of overconfidence. People are certain that they are right in assumptions and latch on to findings and data that support their convictions. Another factor which affects objective decision-making in individuals is decision fatigue. On the surface, it does not seem to be a debilitating activity to make important decisions. However, exerting the energy required to analyze several alternatives and solely decide responsibility for one is notable. For this reason, making several successive decisions affects an individual's ability to objectively interpret and evaluate information. As the day goes on, the ability to make sound judgments diminishes. As we see, individual decision-making may have its drawbacks. Decision-making accomplished by groups of individuals can capitalize on the strengths of multiple individuals. These concepts are at play in my everyday world as I manage a team of project managers. In group-to-individual transfer, group team members become more accurate during interaction. And this is true not only insofar as idea sharing enriches each other's knowledge, but the varied perspectives and motivations contribute to this as well. For example, I was debating with someone what might be included in a work process. I was making my point from the perspective of what the customer needs, and my employee was arguing from something seemingly irrelevant. Once I saw the problem from his perspective, I completely changed my stance. He was looking to include something in this process that would be more engaging for our employees. Because if the employee doesn't use the process correctly, the customer won't even have a chance to have their needs met. Without that group conversation, I would not have adopted that knowledge, and ultimately, had I designed that process on my own, it wouldn't have been as successful. But complexity impairs group effectiveness in decision making. As a problem gets more complex, the group may not perform as highly as the best individual. I've come to realize that although everyone may want to be involved in the decision-making process, having too many people involved is debilitating. Although the greater number of individuals, the less the likelihood the rules for decision-making will satisfy everyone. I encourage groups to make specific decisions such as what will we capture on this form and what should this report reflect. But for more complex decisions, such as what will this new process look like for accomplishing this task, I try to limit how many individuals have input. Regardless of the decision-making rules that may be followed, groups that take a structured approach to decision-making outperform those that do not. If a leader can establish an agreed-upon rule early about how decisions will be made, debate about decisions is more likely to follow that designed path. So obviously, group decision-making can have advantages. However, as we mentioned, it can also have its pitfalls.
The first decision-making pitfall is groupthink. Groupthink occurs when team members place consensus above all other priorities, including good judgment, when the consensus reflects poor judgment or improper or immoral actions. We will be reviewing symptoms of groupthink, historical and personal examples of groupthink, as well as how to avoid it. Some of the symptoms of groupthink. This occurs when group members regard themselves as invulnerable and morally correct, which allows them to believe they are exempt from standards. Closed-mindedness, in which members of the group engage in collective rationalization, often accompanied with stereotyping out group members. And pressures toward uniformity. There's no room for diversity of opinion in groupthink. Dissenters are subject to enormous social pressure. This often leads group members to suppress their reservations. Some of the lapses in judgment involved in groupthink are that the team will not look for alternatives or create contingency plans whatsoever. So a couple of historical examples of groupthink. First is Enron. The leaders of Enron behaved in highly unethical ways, from false accounting to even causing rolling blackouts throughout California. There was a highly competitive culture where 10% of the company would be let go every year, and the company literally crashed and burned and left thousands of people in financial ruin. In the Salem witch trials, the beliefs of the leaders were literally law. Anyone who behaved differently from the norm or spoke out against the trials was labeled a witch and could even be killed. A personal example of groupthink that I've encountered is at the company I currently work for. There are 4 different offices in various locations across the US. Our supervisor has spread the belief that our location is the best of the best. She tells us that we work the hardest and produce the most out of all the offices, and that we ultimately set the bar for the other locations. Our Phoenix team does not behave in immoral ways or go against process in any way, but there is certainly a strong feeling among my team as a whole that we set the standard and everyone else must live up to it. This has certainly, over time, led to the Phoenix team thinking of the other team members as part of the out group, and therefore as less skilled and less competent. There are often such strong negative feelings toward the other locations that we can't even put a member of the Phoenix team and one of the other team locations into the same chat together without feelings getting hurt. The initial suggestion of Phoenix's superiority from our supervisor led to a plague of groupthink that spread across our team very quickly. There are a few ways to avoid groupthink, however. The first is to create smaller team sizes. You can also provide a face-saving mechanism for teams to help mitigate the fear of being blamed for a wrong decision. Another way is to use the risk technique to allow team members to be more comfortable expressing their fears or doubts on a subject. You can also allow team members to invite different perspectives into the discussion backed by data rather than emotion. Another way is to appoint a devil's advocate and create an environment where managers' ideas can be challenged as opposed to only being agreed with. You can use structured discussion principles to increase the problem-solving phase and delay solution selection. You can also establish procedures for protecting alternative viewpoints, such as making sure all ideas are recorded during meetings. You can have teams come up with a second solution or a plan B to their first plan to help encourage problem-solving skills. And lastly, you can try to remove as much time pressure as possible because it does not help in the decision-making process.
Another decision-making pitfall of groups is an escalation of commitment, taking it up a notch. This is when individuals decide to continue on a losing course of action despite clear evidence to the contrary. In recent weeks, I've wondered whether I am in an escalation of commitment situation now with a large project. There are 4 possible processes in escalation of commitment. A project determinant regards that situation itself. If a setback is minor or temporary, it may be worth escalating resources into a project, but if a setback is major or long-term, then different consideration must be given. It may be difficult to know how major or long-term a setback is until it has crossed a point of difficult return. In a particular project I have, in May there was a major IT setback that was to be pushed back into Q4. So we regrouped and modified the project that deadline. But here we are in Q4 and the IT setback now has no due date. So we've modified the project yet again, but we're at a point where we will barely achieve the initial expectation of that project. Had I known, I would have changed course in the past. This would be but one way to arrive at a psychological determinant. A psychological determinant is a decision based on a personal payoff, reputation, or ego rather than best outcomes. Being candid, I can feel the psychological determinant. Mid-year, I defended our IT department pretty heavily against my detracting peers because I knew they had the capability to deliver a product that would meet all of our needs. My peers were right, however, in that it would not happen. But because I put a stake in the ground, I'm now personally attached to this decision. A social determinant of escalation of commitment is when a group has a strong social identity. The closer people are to each other, the more likely they are to invest in a losing course of action. And lastly, a structural determinant is where a project has become organized, not unlike education or healthcare, where obvious solutions would significantly benefit health and welfare, but are impossible to start because the systems are built into themselves and fixing any one aspect requires fixing all aspects together. So there are several ways to overcome these escalations. If early on you set limits to what commitments are tolerable, if you avoid playing a bystander role when you are yourself a part of the project, if you collect perspectives from as many people as possible to avoid myopia and tunnel vision, and if you're willing to walk away from sunk costs with the understanding that you are ultimately saving more costs in the end, you can avoid escalation of commitment.
The third decision-making pitfall is the Abilene paradox. This is also referred to as pluralistic ignorance. The Abilene paradox is a group member's desire to avoid conflict and reach consensus at all costs. We will be reviewing key factors of the Abilene paradox as well as ways to avoid it. Factors. The first is the presence of someone with expertise. When team members perceive that there is someone highly skilled or of high experience on their team, they will tend to self-limit. Another key factor is the presentation of a compelling argument. If a coherent argument is made at the right time, it can affect the decision-making process, and the team member again will self-limit. A lack of confidence in one's ability to contribute. If a team member is unsure of themselves or in their ability to contribute, they'll again self-limit. An unimportant or meaningless decision. Unless the decision is seen as vital or important to the individual's well-being, the team member may adopt a who cares attitude. When there's pressure from others to conform to the team's decision. And lastly, when there's a dysfunctional decision-making climate. When it's perceived that there are feelings of frustration, indifference, disorganization, and unwillingness to commit among the team, an individual is again likely to self-limit. There are, however, some ways to avoid the Abilene paradox. One of the best ways is to confront the issue in a team setting. This involves just being straightforward and voicing concerns, even though they weren't voiced in the past. Another way is to conduct a private vote, anonymity of all team members. You can also try to minimize status differences as much as possible to help avoid intimidation. This means removing status symbols from the equation, such as clothing, location, and using titles. You can encourage team members to use the scientific method. That way, they have to look at evidence as opposed to personal beliefs. So, provide a formal forum for controversial views. Members to not have to worry about bringing up contradicting views when instead it's encouraged. And lastly, take responsibility for failure. Create an environment where team members can make mistakes, take ownership of them, and move on. In a personal example, I've definitely fallen into the Abilene paradox many times throughout my life. I was especially susceptible to this pitfall when I began working at my first full-time job. I was relatively young and had gone through the life-altering event of my sister passing away and was very fragile and vulnerable. At that time, being a good employee in my mind meant being agreeable and never questioning any direction I was given. My goal was to be the ideal worker. My boss would say jump and I'd say how high. I viewed myself as very inexperienced and viewed my other coworkers and supervisor as experts in the field since they had been there for years longer than I had. I can remember my boss starting to encourage us to work overtime so that we could get more work done in the day, but that we would not be getting paid for it. Of course, I knew this wasn't ethical. I knew that if I was being encouraged to work overtime, that I should be paid for it. However, I was far too afraid to voice my opinion and be looked at as if I were complaining or being difficult. I finally got the confidence to confide in a coworker that I trusted, and they had a talk with the supervisor on my behalf. I have certainly gained more confidence over the years, but at times I still find myself stumbling on this pitfall.
Another decision-making pitfall is group polarization. Groups tend to make more extreme judgments than any single individuals within the group. This is because of normative influence, which moves the opinions of the group into alignment with the general direction of the group's existing opinions. I've seen this take place especially in interviews. Immediately after an interview, a group of 3 interviewers may share a moderate opinion one way or the other about a candidate, but not uncommon, after a few minutes of conversation, one point that was brought up and agreed upon becomes a focal point, the direction of which sets the direction of the entire conversation. In some situations, it's concerning to see how much influence the need to be in social congruence has over people. This normative influence causes group conversations to move toward extreme edges of group stances. This causes risky or cautious shifts in decision-making. Groups are not necessarily more risky or cautious, but the conclusions they come to are rooted in deeper conviction.
The fifth and final pitfall is unethical decision-making. We will be reviewing situational triggers as well as the rational man model and accountability. Situational triggers. The first would be the rational Man model. According to this model, people are fundamentally motivated to maximize their own self-interest. However, this model assumes people are more self-interested than they actually are, while it also convinces people that they are more self-driven than they actually are. On top of that, people who take business courses are often more likely to engage in questionable or unethical behaviors than ones that do not. Another situational trigger is pluralistic ignorance. Going along with the majority even though you do not agree, using the rationalization of everyone else is doing it. Another situational trigger is desensitization. This occurs when someone is exposed to unethical behavior so many times that they become desensitized to it. This happens in the same sense as if you're exposed to the same smell for a length of time, and soon you can no longer smell it even though the odor remains. Another situational trigger is lack of accountability for behavior. A team that feels accountable for their behavior are more likely to behave ethically. Accountability is defined as the implicit or explicit expectation that one may be called on to justify one's own beliefs, feelings, and actions to others. There are different types of accountability. The first is accountability to an audience with known versus unknown views. If a person knows what conclusion the audience wants to hear, they will often conform. When the person does not know what the audience wants to hear, they will make more rational and effective decisions. The next type is pre versus post-decision accountability. After a person irrevocably commits themselves to a decision, they will attempt to justify their decision. People form less complex thoughts and become more defensive in their views when they are held accountable. Another type of accountability is outcome accountability versus process accountability. Accountability for outcomes leads to greater escalation behavior, whereas accountability for process increases decision-making effectiveness. There's also legitimate versus illegitimate accountability. If a person's accountability is seen as illegitimate, intrusive, or insulting, any possible good effects of accountability could be lost. A good way to avoid unethical decision-making is to use the reward model. It's the reward model is a way that you can fall into unethical decision-making. Reward and promotion can help shape behavior in an organization. Team members can turn to unethical behavior in order to get access to a reward. Another way that you can fall into unethical decision-making is appropriate role models. For obvious reasons, leaders play a prominent role in how ethical their team is. If a leader is highly ethical, their team will be more likely to behave in ethical ways. Lastly, there's eliminate conflicts of interest. This can cause unethical decision-making by using power for personal gain. You can also create cultures of integrity. An organization cannot watch every move of every employee all the time to make sure they are behaving ethically. The time when it can't be monitored is when the company's culture and code of ethics should come into play. These things should allow the team member to make the right decisions on their own. When a team member makes their own decision, the leader must reward or discipline them accordingly. A historical example of unethical decision-making would be Bernie Madoff. He scammed billions of dollars from thousands of people and scammed them out of their entire life savings. A personal example would be the company that I currently work for was recently the victim of a scam artist. A scammer somehow disguised himself as an employee on the computer and sent an email to one of the employees in HR asking for all of my company's 2015 W-2s. He did not realize that this was a fake email and sent all W-2s for every employee that worked at my company in 2015. W-2s obviously include all the personal information you could ever need to steal someone's identity. We now have to keep credit freezes on our account, and our company paid for 2 years' worth of a credit monitoring service. The scam artist who tricked our employee was behaving in a very unethical way.
Well, we learning about team decision-making as much as we've enjoyed discussing it. If you would like to learn more on this and other concepts related to developing effective teams, we encourage you to check out the book Making the Team, A Guide for Managers, or consult your local library because knowledge is power. Thank you.